Welcome everyone to the REL Pacific webinar Action Research 101, Research as Teaching Practice. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Kirsten Miller, a Communications Manager here at REL Pacific, and I'll be your facilitator. In just a few moments, I'll be turning this over to our presenter, Dr. Jeffrey Mills. But first, let's start out with some tech tips, our agenda and goals for the day, and a little bit of information about the Pacific region. If you joined via telephone, please enter your audio pin on the control panel in the audio section. I will be muting everyone to avoid the echo, but you're free to ask questions at any time using the questions and chat box. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. And please also familiarize yourself with the control panel tools, such as the questions and chat box, which you can use to answer the questions we'll be posing and to send in those questions for the end of the webinar. We are recording this session, so this will be made available to you after the webinar is concluded. Before we begin the presentation, please take note of the link on your screen. This is a link to a short survey regarding the webinar, and your feedback is really vital to ensuring that we provide the most useful and meaningful events for our participants going forward. We'll also post that link in the comments and questions box, so that'll be a live link that you can go to complete the survey at the end of the webinar. Our agenda today, again, I'm Kirsten Miller. We are in the welcome and goals and context section of our agenda right now. That'll be followed by our presentation by Dr. Jeff Mills. He's a professor of education at Southern Oregon University, and he'll be talking about the origin and foundation, goals and rationale, and the 4 steps of the action research process. We'll conclude that with a question and answer session and wrap up, and then we'll again push out that live survey link. Our goals for today are for you to be able, at the end of this webinar, define action research, understand the steps in the action research process, describe a possible area of focus for your own research, and to consider any ethical concerns involved in your own research in the classroom. Finally, to tailor our presentation to your specific needs, we'd really love to know what your role is in the education field. So I'm going to launch a little poll here, which should be coming out to you now. Please just go ahead and choose your role. And if your role doesn't show up here, feel free to go ahead and add that into the questions and chat box so we can determine how better to tailor this presentation to your specific needs. Looks like the results that are coming in now, it looks like we have pretty high percentage of researchers and evaluators. That's at 78% right now. Well, it's actually in flux. We've got about 40% teachers and about 60% researchers and evaluators. So I'm going to leave that open for just one more second, and I'll go ahead and close that, and that should show you the results there. So before I hand the microphone over to Dr. Mills, I'd like to share with you an introductory video feature on REL Pacific. If you're not already familiar with the REL program or with education across the Pacific region, this 3-minute feature will give you a good overview of our work in the region. It's also available on our YouTube account, which is REL Pacific, the Carl's Pacific Center for Changing the Odds. So you can go ahead and access that after the webinar also. So we hope you enjoy that. Just bear with me for one moment while I pull that up.
REL Pacific at McREL International is one of 10 regional educational laboratories, often referred to as RELs. The RELs are funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. We serve education stakeholders in 3 U.S. Pacific territories: American Samoa, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and Guam, as well as 3 nations in free association with the United States: the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Republic of Palau, and the Federated States of Micronesia, which includes the 4 states of Chuuk, Koshrai, Pohnpei, and Yap. We also serve the state of Hawaii. At REL Pacific, we identify priority needs in the region through comprehensive reviews of education system data and reports, ongoing discussions with education agency staff, and continual contact with the field. We also support consortia called research alliances that bring together stakeholders in the Pacific to work collaboratively to address problems and questions of high priority and relevance in the field of education. Our work focuses on 4 priority topic areas: strengthening teacher effectiveness, engaging families and communities in education, ensuring college and career readiness, and optimizing data systems. REL Pacific is housed at McREL International's Pacific Center for Changing the Odds in Honolulu, Hawaii. We are a private, nonprofit organization that draws upon the best of education research to translate what works into culturally conscious innovations that benefit learners throughout the Pacific. The REL Pacific region is geographically vast. The region served by REL Pacific covers 5 time zones and more than 1,000 islands, islets, and atolls. The region is mostly rural and spans a geographic area larger than the entirety of the continental United States. Although all 7 of the major entities served by REL Pacific use English as the language of instruction, 5 of those 7 also instruct in an indigenous language, such as Chamorro, Marshallese, Palauan, Chuukese, Yapese, Pohnpeian, Cochrayan, Samoan, or Hawaiian. For more information on REL Pacific, please visit our website, relpacific.mcrel.org, and sign up for our newsletter for updates on projects, events, and news.
So now that you're a little more familiar with REL Pacific, I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Dr. Jeffrey Mills. Dr. Mills is a professor of education at Southern Oregon University and author of Action Research, a guide for the teacher researcher. Dr. Mills has presented on Action Research in Australia, New Zealand, extensively in Greenland, the United Kingdom, Canada, and across the United States. He's also a co-author of Educational Research, Competencies for Analysis and Applications, now in its 10th edition. Without further ado, here's Dr. Mills. Again, bear with us for just a moment while I go ahead and hand the screen over to Dr. Mills. And when you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, all right. Hopefully this is working and everyone can see my screen. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Jeff Mills, as Kirsten has just introduced me. I'd like to take a moment to thank Kirsten for her work in setting up this webinar. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Nolan Malone, the director of McREL's Pacific Center for Changing the Odds, for his support in this work. I'm in the comfort of my office here at Southern Oregon University, and I didn't think I would be nervous presenting to people who can't see me, or I can't see you. But hopefully in this audio-based only session, we can make some progress towards our goals today of defining action research, understanding the process, and so on and so forth. As you may have guessed, my accent is from the deep south. I'm an Australian, but I've lived and worked in the United States for 30 years, and as Kirsten just mentioned, I have been engaged in action research work for quite some time, most recently in Greenland, which is perhaps literally the polar opposite of where you might be. My work in Greenland is focused on helping teachers and principals use action research as a way of developing and testing culturally responsive pedagogies and curriculum in a post-colonial Greenland. My work today has been somewhat fueled and helped by the work that came out of the Cacao and Baker's 5 Steps for Structuring Data-Informed Conversations and Actions in Education, an IES publication in September of last year. So, without any other pauses, let's launch into kind of my view of what is action research. Well, as you can see, for me, action research is any systematic inquiry conducted by teacher researchers, principals, school counselors, or other stakeholders in the teaching learning environment to gather information about how their particular schools operate, how they teach, and how well their students learn. That's my working definition, and it's, it's built on a lot of people who have done a lot of work in this area over many, many years. To quote Adelman, it's ordinary people participating in collective research on private troubles that they have in common. The characteristics of action research, and for me it's very much a democratic process that focuses on the professionalization of teaching with a commitment to helping teachers conduct research by themselves, for themselves, to help them gain insights into challenges in their classrooms perhaps, to develop a reflective practice and stance, to effect positive change in the school environment, and to improve student outcomes. Action research, as I write about it, is been heavily influenced by really two main theories, what we would call critical action research and a practical action research approach. But both have a common goal to improve teaching and learning. Critical action research, also known as emancipatory action research, is based on critical theory with a goal of liberation through knowledge gathering. It's participatory and democratic, socially responsive and contextually based. It examines professional practice and is intended to enhance learning, teaching and policy making. When I talk about teacher research, practitioner-based research, I'm also talking about all stakeholders in the educational enterprise. When I write about action research, I tend to write from a very practical-oriented approach. So it's practice-based, it's an emphasis on how to conduct action research. It's a commitment to the professional development of teachers and school improvement. It's focused on teacher researchers who choose their own area of focus and the necessary data collection techniques, analysis and interpretation strategies, and the action plans that follow. It's an engaging process. So what we'd like you to do is to spend a couple of minutes thinking about, I see that a third of us are teachers and 2/3 are researchers and evaluators, but if you were to think about a practice in your own professional world that you perhaps take for granted, that you're challenged by, if you write in the comments question box anything that comes to mind. And if I think about beginning teachers, for example, most beginning teachers are concerned with classroom management issues, but as an administrator perhaps you might be concerned with how to reduce dropout in your school. So if you take a moment to complete the poll. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing anything in the dialog box, so I'll continue. One of the empowering things about conducting action research is that it bridges the gap between research and practice. Teachers will often say that research is inaccessible to them. It's not written to them as an audience. Principals will say the same. They'll say that available research is not always relevant to their practice or considered persuasive or authoritative. And it doesn't really address the frequent changes in education systems and programs that creates this disconnect between research and practice. So some of the great benefits of action research, and if you are familiar with the work of Marzano, Waters and McNulty in School Leadership That Works, one of the strong correlation that exists for school leaders is that being able to monitor the effectiveness of school practices and their impact on student learning has a demonstrated correlation with improving student outcomes. It's in that vein that action research is a benefit for all the stakeholders in our educational enterprises. So some of the benefits of action research is that it's persuasive and authoritative, it's relevant, that teachers have access to their findings, it connects research to practice, and it's really not a fad or an add-on. It's something that good teachers have always systematically looked at as part of the teaching and learning process. So if you again attempt to use the comments question box, to describe what you think the purpose of action research is.
Jeff, this is Kirsten just jumping in. I am able to get to that questions box, so I can read back what we've heard so far from the prior about problems of practice. Some of them that came through was infusing technology effectively in the classroom, group discussion, how much to be specific about discussion questions and how much to leave it up to students who are either undergrad or graduate to talk about what they think is meaningful in the readings, and increasing levels of engagement. So that's the prior poll. And I see a little, a couple of comments coming up here for the purpose of action research. One we have here is to help solve classroom problems. That's all I have coming up right now, but let's give people just another moment to see if there's some more. Investigate something that is meaningful or important to your immediate situation, but that can also be valuable to other teachers. Answering questions that are relevant in my classroom is another one. So thank you everyone for engaging in that poll and for giving us those great answers. And Jeff, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, thanks. And I've just started to be able to see some of those coming through, so thank you. I want to talk for a moment about ethical guidelines for action research. And we don't talk about ethics here in any way to scare people off from doing research into their own practice, but it is a key concern for the researchers and the researched. And I assume that all of you participating today, whether you're a teacher or a researcher at a university, that you have guidelines that you need to follow in your own context in order to protect the confidentiality and anonymity of your research participants. Again, it's we don't discuss it here as a way of causing you any concern about doing action research, but rather to make sure that you're aware that, for example, if you work in a university context, you will need institutional review board approval. Perhaps you should always seek informed consent of your participants. And if you're working in a school or a district, your district will have guidelines to help you with the informed consent process. The underlying, or perhaps the most important principle here is avoidance of harm. That in the research process, we want to make sure that any of the information that we collect does not lead to any harm of any of our participants. And it's certainly unacceptable to deceive people in this process. One of the ways to deal with the ethical issues in conducting research is to develop an ethical perspective that really models your own ethical stance. So if you ever find yourself in a difficult situation, you can respond quickly and naturally in a way that puts all the participants at ease. The other way to ensure ethical practice is to make sure that you, in fact, accurately record all of your data. So like any author, anyone writing about a process, I came up with my own what I call a dialectic action research spiral and a 4-step process that guides us through the action research process. The first step is to identify an area of focus. This leads to a data collection strategy or strategies to help answer your research questions. Next, we have the analysis and interpretation of data, and based on what we learn, we develop an action plan for educational change. Action research is intended to lead directly to improvement and change of practice. It's not, arguably, it's not to contribute necessarily to a generalizable body of knowledge. We're trying to work with local problems and local solutions. Identifying an area of focus. There's lots of ways that each of us can tackle some of these questions, and the poll earlier started to identify some of these questions. You know, how to solve classroom behavior problems, how to advance a new reading curriculum perhaps. But the idea of a general idea or an area of focus is what is it that strikes you every day when you walk into your classroom perhaps, that you feel challenged by, that you know that you're willing to change and improve upon. So some ways to go about doing that is through conducting reconnaissance. That's a fancy way of saying reflect on the information that you're collecting in your classroom, in your school. We'll talk more in a moment about reviewing, analysing and reporting literature and the role that that has in helping you with your area of focus. And finally, creating an action research plan, which is one of the things we'll try and do today, at least give you the guidelines for that. So my guidelines for helping you identify an area of focus is to clarify that that area of focus is in your locus of control. This is perhaps a statement of the obvious, that you want to conduct research that is in your control. You're not necessarily studying somebody else. It should involve teaching and learning and should focus on your own practice. It's something that you should feel passionate about, and it's something that you would like to change or improve upon. Time taken in the early stages of the action research process, this area of focus, problem statement, first step, is critical to a successful action research process. So conducting reconnaissance into your action research area of focus will lead you to reflect on your own beliefs and understanding the nature and context of your idea. It perhaps will also help you explore your understanding of your theories of practice, your educational values, how your work in schools fits into the context of schooling and society, the historical context of your own school, and how you arrive at your beliefs about teaching and learning. It's a way to help you describe the situation you want to change and improve upon. If you will, the who, what, when, where, and how of the situation. And it will, excuse me, and it will allow you to explain the situation that you plan to investigate. Reviewing, analysing, and reporting the literature. As I've thought about this, there are many resources available to all of us in terms of accessing existing research data, or I should say the research literature. Sources such as ERIC, the Educational Resources Information Centre, professional organisations, and the What Works Clearinghouse, one of IES's wonderful websites that covers topics such as math problem solving, improving reading comprehension, early childhood instructional strategies and so on, is a wonderful starting place for you as you look at what does the current research tell us that will help us in our own research efforts. So the process of getting into the research literature involves using keywords and sources and databases, like I say, such as ERIC, and professional organisations such as the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, ASCD, and other professional organisations. But you know, the literature review part of any research process is a very helpful starting place for beginning researchers and action researchers, particularly if once we focus on our area of focus statement, our problem statement, and we are trying to identify a promising practice, an intervention, something that will help us address the challenge that we're facing. And again, the What Works Clearinghouse is a wonderful starting point for all of us. So to help you get started with your action research process, I have here a kind of a straightforward guideline for creating an action research plan. It starts off, it starts off with writing an area of focus statement. These statements are typically in the form of the purpose of this study is to describe the impact of some particular intervention on student achievement. If you think of the What Works Clearinghouse, that might be something related to early childhood literacy, comprehension, math curriculum improvement, and so on. The next step is to define the variables involved in your research process. In order to search the literature, you need to be clear about what it is that you're focused on. So variables, if you will, the parts of the action research process that you wish to focus on, the particular teaching, curriculum, instruction, or assessment practice that you wish to investigate. Once you've come up with your area of focus and the variables that you wish to investigate, the next natural step is the development of specific research questions. Once you have this in mind, then it's possible to move on to a description of an intervention or innovation. My current work in Greenland, in working with school principals, is to focus on an endemic problem in Greenland of student dropout. And so those principals working with their teachers are trying to develop interventions to help children stay in school. And one of their starting places is in fact the What Works Clearinghouse on this subject. Action research doesn't have to be done in isolation, and in fact I would encourage all action researchers, all teacher researchers, all people wishing, all the stakeholders who wish to be empowered and engaged in this democratic process to consider broadening the membership of their action research group. A school administrator can do this through working with his or her teachers to develop a school-focused project, such as on student dropout. But grade level teams might decide to work on a particular focus related to a particular area that they identify. So describing the membership of your action research group is a step. You also need to describe any negotiations that need to be undertaken in the research process. Whether or not you need to talk to a supervisor, whether you need to work with parents, children, policy makers, and so on. Next, develop a timeline. And while this is just a guide, it's a very important guide to help set timelines for the development of your research questions, your area of focus, your data collection timeline, analysis and interpretation, and action planning. Resources. Many of us will say, particularly those of us who are researchers, that we need resources in order to implement any of our research processes. If you need funding for a new curriculum intervention, this is a good time to start with identifying what resources you need. And then data collection ideas. Once you get clear about your research question, then we start to talk about the development of a data collection matrix and the use of multiple data sources to answer our questions. Data collection can be in the form of qualitative data collection techniques and quantitative data collection techniques. And as I referenced the IES publications earlier, there are many examples in that publication about the existing data sources that all schools and districts currently have available to them. When I write about action research, I focus more on qualitative data collection techniques, what I call the 3 E's of data collection: inquiring, examining, and experiencing. If you will, I study schools and I study classrooms through the lens of an educational anthropologist, using the triangulation of data from multiple qualitative data sources. So now that I actually have the questions and comments box open, what types of data do you currently use to make decisions about your practice? You could take a moment to list some ideas about that. What kinds of data collection techniques do you currently use to make decisions about your practice? For me as a university professor, my data sources are perhaps final assignments submitted by, in my case, educational, administration, leadership, class students, people who want to be principals, and the kinds of essays they write and their practicum experiences that demonstrate their proficiencies required for licensure in the state of Oregon. So, Kirsten, I'm not seeing anything.
Yeah, I was just about to jump in. I do have that question pane. So it looks like we've got some great answers here. Student work, formal and informal writing, and listening in on discussions. Surveys and questionnaires. Quantitative, formative and summative assessments. Standardized test scores, just similar. Student evaluations, dean class visits, surveys. How my students are doing on their assessments, both formal and informal. And here's one that's interesting. It's feedback from my fellow teachers. So some great answers across the board.
Excellent. Thank you. So let me just talk, excuse me, let me just talk a little bit more about data collection techniques. Many of those that you've identified fall very clearly into my inquiring, examining, and experiencing ideas for data collection. Perhaps one of the important points to make about data collection is, schools and districts have access to large amounts of data, whether it's attendance data, standardized test score data, feedback from supervisors about teaching performance and so on and so forth. But depending on your area of focus, it may be that you have ready access to a wide range of data sources that are already available in your setting. Here are a few more ideas about data collection techniques and sources. Existing archival sources within your system, conventional sources, such as surveys and questionnaires. And as the title of this webinar suggests, Action Research 101, it's, as I'm realizing, a challenge for me to summarize a 300-page book into a 60-minute webinar. But hopefully in talking about this today, I'll at least get your appetite and interest aroused. So, conventional sources I talked about, invented sources, exhibits, student portfolios, interviews. I write a lot about what I call ethnographic interviews. They're ongoing in our work with students in our classrooms, with our colleagues. Oral histories, observations either as a participant observer or non-participant observer, mapping of classrooms, visual recordings, audio recordings, photography, journals and diaries, and so on. And that's on top of all of the test data that we regularly collect in our schools. And in addition to the wonderful ideas you've already generated about data collection. Before I talk about analysis and interpretation of data, I just want to also add that once we get into the action research process, our area of focus, our research questions, and we start to collect data, there's always the distinct possibility that once we get into our data collection process, that we realize that maybe the questions that we started with aren't the questions that are perhaps most compelling. So in my dialectic action research spiral, I have an arrow that actually routes back from data collection back to area of focus. The action research process is a living, breathing process, and it's possible that throughout the process you refine your questions and engage in some other data collection efforts that you hadn't thought about initially. So step 3 would be analysis and interpretation of data. And the appropriate qualitative data analysis interpretation techniques depends very much on the kind of qualitative data you've collected. Narrative, normative data requires us to help identify themes in our data. Quantitative data analysis is more likely to be related to reducing our students' test scores to averages, means, modes, and medians, trying to reduce our data to numbers in a way that help us understand the impact of a particular intervention or innovation on our student performance. Developing an action plan for educational change. This kind of jumps from the beginning of the process to the end of the process. And for me, action research is what makes it important for classroom practitioners and principals is that there is no research without action and no action without research. And so an important part of the process for me is developing a steps to action chart. And so at the end of the process, once you've been through the area focus process, the research question process, the data analysis and interpretation process, the important step is to identify what will you do next? What will you do differently next time you engage in perhaps a refined implementation of a particular teaching strategy or a curriculum innovation, to make sure that it doesn't just stop at a summary statement of this is what I learned. It's an important statement of this is what I plan to do next based on what I learned. And that action planning can be at the individual level, the team level, or at the school-wide level. And I would even suggest at the system-wide level. it's important that we contribute to our knowledge base in all of these areas. And it's an opportunity for you to share what you've learned. In my work in Greenland, one of the things we're trying to do is to publish for the first time the work of Indigenous Inuit educators in Greenland to share what they're learning about the development of culturally responsive curriculum and pedagogy in the Arctic region. There's been very little written about this, and it would be an important contribution to peoples in and around the polar region. Just bear with me for a moment. So I think, Kirsten, I'm at a point where we can take some questions.
So I have the questions pane open, so if you'd like to type in a question for Jeff, I can go ahead and impart that. As you, I'm sure, have noticed, we've had a few little technical glitches, so thank you for sticking with us and bearing with us through those. But if you have any questions, please go ahead and add those into the questions and comments box. I don't see anything coming up just yet. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and into the chat box, I'm going to add that live link to the stakeholder feedback survey that I mentioned earlier. And again, that's really just super helpful for us to know what kinds of events we can bring you, what you may have found helpful, or even anything that you might have liked to change about this event. Just things that that we can bring to you in the future. So if you are able to take a few minutes and complete that, we would very much appreciate it. I'll also be sending out a link to the archive of this webinar, the recording, and the slides. We will put that on our website as well, and I'll include that that survey link in that follow-up also. We'll give it just another minute to see if there are any questions. And again, when I send this follow-up email also, if something comes to mind between now and then, please feel free to email me. That'll come from my email, and you'll be able to have that to respond to. So do feel free to email me directly with any questions once you receive that. I do have a question coming in from Ruth. Thank you, Ruth. So the question is, what action research have you conducted?
Okay. My most recent action research that I've participated in, and it's been it's interesting when, as a university-based teacher and researcher, and someone who writes a lot about doing research, it leaves you less time to conduct research. But one of the things I do for fun, and for me, doing action research is a fun part of being a professional educator, is my books are used in about 300 universities in the United States, and I often get invited to participate in other people's action research classes, for example at Vanderbilt University, Kent State University, through the wonders of Skype and Google Hangout and Adobe Connect. I'll be asked to participate in and to a certain degree team teach action research sessions with other university-based teachers. And so I participated last year in a collaborative action research project with a professor at Vanderbilt University and a professor at Kent State University, where we were actually looking at the impact of the use of those technologies such as Google Hangout and access to the textbook author, that would be me, through email, the impact on student engagement and the quality of their action research project. So, I mean, that was our intervention, was, if you will, the technology, and the focus was essentially, the impact of involving me in those other classes. And perhaps not surprisingly, what we learned was that the student outcomes weren't significantly different than what the professors had experienced in the past, but the students reported a high degree of satisfaction and engagement in the classes, and enjoyed the ability to interact directly with their textbook author and have conversations with him. So that was a lot. I mean, my research has been focused on essentially the impact of me teaching action research on student outcomes, my student outcomes in terms of their own research processes. So that's the research I've been engaged in most recently. My next project will be based on my work in Greenland, where I go back in November to work with high school principals in Greenland to develop a leadership program that is culturally respectful and appropriate in the Greenlandic context, in really a post-colonial setting where the principals are all Danish educators who are working in Greenland, and yet in Greenland there is no formal leadership training. So it's the development of a leadership program, and then the impact of that program on the success of the high school reform movement in Greenland. So I hope that answers your question. Was it Ruth?
Yes, and Jeff, we do have another great question from Elizabeth. How do you respond to grad students who are told that action research isn't real research because it's generalized?
Yeah.
Generalized inquiry.
Yeah. Thanks, Elizabeth. That's a question that I've had when I wrote my first edition of the Action Research book. It came out in 2000, and one of the reviewers said, you know, action research is just garbage research because it's not, quote, generalizable. It doesn't have external validity. And of course, today graduate students will still be influenced by a perception that the only valid research is research that's based on a pre-test, post-test control group design experimental research model. And my argument is, in fact, that, well, for many, many years, the qualitative research, quantitative research debate has raged, and in fact, I think it's time that we put that argument to rest, that the different kinds of research, the different methodologies have different goals. I mean, the aim of action research is to increase our understanding of the effectiveness of a particular intervention in a classroom on student achievement. It doesn't meet the tenets of experimental research, where we can randomly assign to a control group and an experimental group the participants in our classroom. You know, we all inherit as teachers a classroom of children, and we don't randomly assign those children to those classrooms. So, you know, it's a different goal and a different aim, and our aim is to understand, not to prove, not to reject some kind of null hypothesis at a predetermined p-value. So my argument for graduate students is to assure them that there are professional organizations and refereed journals that publish action research, that it is valued in the academy, but it's not making claims for generalizability to all schools or any other classroom for that matter. Does that help, Elizabeth? I hope.
Jeff, Elizabeth has another comment that I think I think you've actually touched on a bit, but she notes that her IRB doesn't think they need to have action research studies reviewed because they're not generalizable, and they don't think anyone outside of the team will be interested. But you did speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I would just say, in terms of IRB approval, it does vary. At my own university, students doing action research as a class assignment do not require IRB approval, but we do require that they meet any of the guidelines required by the school districts in which they are working. But again, IRBs will often get into a debate about, well, if you're not trying to, generalize. I mean, usually IRBs will also use the idea of, well, if you're going to share the findings at a professional meeting or in a publication, then you do need IRB approval, and that's most classroom researchers aren't doing that. Most teacher researchers aren't going to publish their work, although they could. But yeah, it's an interesting question for an IRB to tackle.
So we do have another question from Nolan. Can action research studies contribute to the development of larger, more comprehensive studies such as RCTs?
Can action research studies contribute to
the development of larger, more comprehensive studies such as RCTs? I think the question is, can we use action research as a launching point?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly argue that the question, the answer is yes, and in fact, depending on the nature of the study, if it's a school-wide or a district-wide action research focus, that because the way I approach action research is a predominantly qualitative research method or approach, design, if you will, that in the process of doing action research, we're going to uncover a lot of information that will help us in a mixed methods research mode, perhaps come up with a answer. It'll come up with more questions than it answers. It'll answer the local contextually based question, but it may raise more systemic questions that then lead to a larger research agenda for a particular system. So, if we have a lot of teachers or a teacher looking at the development of third grade reading comprehension skills through the use of a new reading program in their classroom, it may be that leads to a larger study of the implementation of a particular reading program in a school, a district, a system that uses perhaps a more quantitatively oriented research design. So, yeah, I think that absolutely they can contribute to a larger research agenda. And I'll just add one more statement there. I mean, it could also be that through the teacher's commitment to studying what is challenging in their own classroom and school, that helps policymakers better understand the challenges from the classroom level. Because it's by teachers, for teachers, focused and committed to the improvement of student outcomes in a way that, starting systemically from the outside looking in is perhaps not possible.
Okay, it looks like that's all the questions that we have. Thank you again, everyone, for participating. We know that this has been a lot of information in a short time frame. So again, once you do receive that follow-up email from me, if any other questions come up, please do let us know. We're happy to follow up with you individually. Any questions on your specific situation or any broader questions as well. I'm going to go ahead and leave up the link to our stakeholder feedback survey for those of you who have not clicked onto that yet and had a moment to complete that. I will again send that out in my follow-up as well. But again, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you at future Rural Pacific webinars.